about something other than little, almost meaningless things. I grew up with absolutely no worries about myself. I never really felt threatened, never really felt under any kind of horrible pressure, and it really wasn't even in the Marines. I didn't ever feel like my life was in danger, and I was probably in my mid-20s. I remember I was living in my parents' basement. I was a mid-20s living in my parents' basement. That sounds great, doesn't it? And I remember looking out of the window and thinking, I have absolutely no worries whatsoever. That really changes when you become a parent, doesn't it? It really begins to change when you get married, and then it just compounds as you become a parent. And then I've learned as your children get older, it just compounds even more. And then apparently at some point they get married. We haven't reached that stage in our family yet. And then it compounds even more when they begin to get married and have children. I want you to look at Proverbs 22 and verse 17. And I want us to consider just a few verses this evening. Proverbs 2:17. Bow down your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge. For it is a pleasant thing if you keep them within you, then they will be fitted in your lips. That your trust will be in the Lord, and I have made known to you this day, even to you. Have I not written to you in excellent things, in counsels and knowledge, that I may make known to you the certainty of the words of truth, that you might answer the words of truth to them that send unto you? You listen to parents talk about their children, and probably the conversations are in one of two ways. Either they're relaying to you concerns that they're having for their kids, and so it's kind of a heavy conversation, or it's something funny that happened that their children did. In fact, I've become convinced that this is one of the reasons why God allows these things to happen, because parenting is so difficult that God gives you those funny moments to kind of tie you over through the difficult times. You can kind of remember the funny moments. And I know that every parent has stories about those things. And yet, on the other hand, as a child, you remember the funny things your parents do. And you start thinking about those. And I was thinking about some of the funny stories of my parents and my family and growing up. And this Thanksgiving, we were with my parents, and my dad began recounting for everybody to hear, I guess. It was for a wider audience than just me, about when my sister, I might have been 6 or 7 years old, and my sister got lost. She had wandered off from the house when she wasn't supposed to and got lost. And so my dad and my mom began searching for her, and apparently, I don't really remember this. I guess I remember little bits and pieces of it, but I don't remember the story like they do. Apparently, I had a tricycle, so I must have been younger than 6. But I had this tricycle, and I also had with it a fireman's hat. And so apparently, my dad is recounting the story. I put the fireman's hat on my head and began riding around the streets around our house, helping the search for my baby sister who had wandered off and gotten lost. And I'm listening to the story going, that's humiliating. That's horribly embarrassing. I don't want anybody to hear this story. You could keep this story to yourself. This isn't that funny. I don't find it very funny. You bought me the tricycle and you bought me the fireman's hat. I mean, you set me up to have this happen. I don't like that. But sometimes children do wander off and get lost. And so I immediately tried to turn the attention onto my own son, who had once decided not to join us as we left the church when we were meeting over on Cary Parkway. And I began turning it on to him. And now he's probably thinking at the time, I don't want to hear this. This is humiliating. Why are you telling this story? People do get lost. Every fall, cornfields, the farmers will grow up their corn and cut out a little maze, and you'll have an opportunity to go through one of those. You pay a little bit of money. There's a farmer nearby here who does these. And you get in the corn maze, and he cuts the cornfield in such a way that you really can get turned around. It's higher than you can see over it. You can't. You're kind of wandering through this corn maze, and it's easy to get lost. And so, in order to prevent people from just being stuck in the man's cornfield, that would be awful. They put a chair on like a little tower. Usually that's a hunting stand or something. So somebody can look down into the cornfield and see all the people who are lost wandering around. And when a person gets totally lost and they just give up and they say, I'm sorry, they know they can look up because there's a guy sitting there and saying, hey, okay, here's what you do. Take a left and take another left. And yeah, right there where you took another left, you should have gone right. And it's really easy and you get out of the corn maze. I was thinking about what it must be like to grow up in our culture today. I would guess that for our children, it's a lot like getting lost. I think generationally, every older generation tends to look at younger generations with some level of distrust and a little bit of disdain. And younger generations do the same to older generations. In fact, my children taught me a new phrase I had not heard until just recently when they shared it with me. But apparently, young people are making fun of older people by the phrase "Okay, boomer." It's just kind of a put down, a pejorative to older people. And I had not heard that. Maybe you are on Instagram or something and you've heard this, or somewhere around social media, but I had not heard that. But, generationally, young people look at older people and say you're out of touch, and older people look at young people and say there's something wrong with you. But I will tell you this. I think we who are of an older generation, and in 10 days I'm 50, so I'm now willing to say I'm of an older generation. I think we who are of an older generation need to look at young people and realize that it is a lot different growing up in an American culture today than it was 25 and 30 years ago. Now, some of you are old enough to remember what it was like to have prayer in the public schools. I wasn't old enough to remember that. Okay, that's before my time. But some of you remember having prayer in the public schools. You remember how it was a lot different in the 40s and 50s and 60s and maybe even early 1970s than it was in the 80s and 90s as I was coming to maturity. But even that is a far cry from what children are going through today. To grow up in our culture, I just want you to think about this. And I'm not saying everything's bad in our culture. I don't want you to get the sense that I'm just knocking everything that's going on today. I mean, there's a lot of good things going on. I'm really glad for the way our culture is answering some of the problems for the way women have been mistreated in times past. I'm really glad for some of the ways that we're approaching racism and trying to eradicate that from our culture. And I'm really glad that abortion is on the decline. But I think that children in our culture probably grow up feeling a lot like saltwater taffy. Have you ever seen saltwater taffy just being pulled on that machine, pulled and stretched and torn in different directions? I mean, think about what children are having to answer today. Questions about gender and the whole LGBT movement. That's not an adult conversation. I'm telling you, that's a child conversation that's being had with children. Children are being, especially as they're in junior high and high school, are being presented with economic issues that they really don't understand, probably because their professors are pushing an economic system onto them that's really negative. I think also, and this has become prevalent, but coarse and foul language is just prevalent in our society. It's everywhere. You just walk through the mall and you hear people talk to each other, and it's breathtaking. I was standing with my wife watching this outdoor kind of event take place, and we were standing next to each other, and I bumped into a lady behind me, and I turned around to say, I'm sorry. And she was a young lady, probably in her mid-20s, and she was from Connecticut. And so we started talking, and I've never met a stranger. We just started talking. My wife's trying to hide at this point, but I'm having a conversation with her, and within about 3 sentences, she starts lacing every other sentence with swear words, and not just kind of the Christian swear words that people use, the really heavy, shock you, make you gasp out loud kind of swear words. And what surprised me was, I'm a stranger, she doesn't know me, and she feels comfortable enough just to say that kind of thing in public. And that's the culture our children are growing up in. And how about the acceptance of sexual sin? This is just common to the point where there are some things I'd like to talk to you about at some point, but we're going to have to move all the children out of the room because it's a pretty heavy topic. But you deal with sexual sins, and it's pretty heavy and pretty difficult. But it's becoming conversations that are being had in junior high and even earlier. Things I never even thought about, never even crossed my mind back then. And today, children are having these conversations. And then the acceptance of non-Christian philosophies with an accompanying rejection of Christianity. So that's our culture. That's the worldview that's being pressed down upon our children. And if you think it's unique, it may be worse in the sense of our day, but can I just take you for a moment and pick you up and lift you and transport you back to Solomon's day and just plop you down in Jerusalem around the time of Solomon? And I want you to stop for a moment and think about what it would be to grow up in his culture. Because here were some of the things going on in Solomon's culture and around Solomon, not necessarily in Jerusalem, but around Solomon. Idolatry is rampant, especially as Solomon gets older, right? You have him intermarrying with different kingdoms around him for political reasons. These were often just political marriages, but he had all of these wives, and they turned Solomon's heart away from the Lord, the scripture says, to idolatry. And so you have in Jerusalem a burgeoning idolatry, and then right outside of Jerusalem there are pockets of this, and then the farther you get away from Jerusalem it becomes more pronounced, but you have a problem of stuff that is so awful, like child sacrifice. You start reading some of these stories in the Old Testament, and your jaw just drops open when you read about how people would murder their own children. I'm not talking about abortion now. I'm talking about infanticide, and sometimes in the worst possible ways. Slavery was common. And it wasn't a racially based slavery like what you would think about when you think about the American antebellum South. This was slavery. If your kingdom got conquered, everybody became a slave. And so it didn't really matter what color you were. It was just if your nation got conquered, you became a slave. Immorality was everywhere. I know the Bible was teaching in the Old Testament that you shouldn't commit immorality, even advocating some pretty severe discipline for those who did. But by Solomon's day, those judgments were really not being applied. So if you're growing up in Solomon's day, if you're parenting in Solomon's day, can I just say for a moment that it was probably similarly bad and similarly difficult? So when you read what Solomon is writing here to parents and how he's trying to parent his own children, I think there's some similarity between his day and ours. And so what Solomon is doing as a solution to the parenting problem that he's facing is he's saying to his son, here's what I want you to do. I want you to be wise. Because if you can be wise, you can actually avoid many of the traps and pitfalls that are around you. That was his encouragement from father to son. And I think likewise, we as parents should be encouraging our children to be wise. As parents, we're kind of like the guy in the chair above the maze. Right? We're the ones that when they get lost in the field of life, just kind of should be able to look up to and say, okay, where do I go now? And we ought to be able to take them as parents and turn them to God and to His Word so that they will have a better understanding of the direction they should go. So let me offer you some ideas from this text about what Solomon is doing. First of all, he advocates here, he says that Christian parents must instruct their children in the way of truth. If you try to start teaching your kids about truth at the moment of crisis, then you've failed. You're supposed to be teaching them truth all the time. from the very beginning. Spiritual instruction is a parental responsibility, he says in verse 17. Bow down your ear and hear the words of the wise and apply your heart. Do you see almost a three-step process here? We have bowing down, hearing, and then applying. And the command is given to children so that they will learn to be wise. Learning is an action that they are commanded to take. They are to be learning from you, but they can't learn from you if you're not teaching them. So the idea here of learning is turning the head in order to listen. Just, as I get older, my hearing starting to slowly diminish, right? Sometimes I have to kind of cock my head a little bit. What are you saying? Say that again, please. I knew an older gentleman who would sometimes get a little tired of listening to his wife once in a while, and I would watch him lead up and just click off his hearing aid. And then he would look at me and he would smile. I can't hear her anymore. As my hearing gets a little worse, I have to cock my head. Can you say that again? I'm having a little trouble hearing you. That's the idea here. Bow down your ear. Listen to what I'm saying. Pay attention to what's being said. And the hearing is connected to two Old Testament things. It's connected to an understanding of something. You can't understand it unless you've heard it. So it's an accumulation of facts, but it's also connected to obeying what you learn. It's obedience by putting those facts into practice, putting the information you have into practice. Now notice the one who's giving the command. It's the parent. The instructor is Solomon. He's saying to his son, bow down your ear and hear the words of the wise. The emphasis is on the words. Listen to my words, son. Here is information you need to learn. And I think probably there's a reference here even that Solomon is passing along something that he learned from somebody else. You almost get a sense of discipleship within that Old Testament context where Solomon is taking something he learned and now he's passing it on to his son. Solomon, of course, was the wisest of men. And that really makes me think then that maybe one of the qualities of wisdom is that you're always learning. I don't have the strength to start parenting over again, but I will tell you that I think it would be great if I could start parenting later in life, because I know that I would have more wisdom in dealing with my children. I just know there's no way I could be strong enough to handle that. So God blesses you by giving you children earlier. But I think that in looking at the way I handled situations back with my children, back when they were little, if I were approaching that situation now, I probably would approach it a little bit differently because of just age, wisdom, experience. Now, even as Solomon is learning and passing on what he's learning, right? He says, I want you to hear this. He says, I want you to apply it. The command is focused on application of what's learned. It's not enough to learn it. It's not enough to know it. I have to do it. So apply means to set something into place. In fact, when you trace the history of the meaning of this word, we go from Hebrew into English, we kind of get the idea of the word stand. That's really kind of what Solomon is saying, is put something in practice by setting it up in place, by standing it up. He's saying taking one stand almost has the idea of a reaction. When you take a stand on something, you're applying information you have to that situation. I refuse to go further. I'm taking my stand. That's an application of what you know. And that's basically what Solomon is saying. Apply this. And the application of this is to the heart, to the inner man, to the innermost parts of man. This is his soul, his mind, his seat of conscience. Take the information I'm giving you, Solomon says, and apply it to the very innermost soul of yourself. Take out some sort of tool and etch this onto your heart. Do you know what Solomon is basically saying to his child? You should be like me. Follow after me. And if a child is learning and a parent is teaching, ultimately you will grow up, that child will grow up to be like his parents. And all the children shudder. No, I don't want to be like my parents. But that's really what's going on here. And I'm going to tell you that some of you might say, well, my parents were not saved. I didn't have that example. And you have an opportunity now to learn God's word and teach it to your children. They should be following you and following the example you're setting. And I'm saying so much it's predicated on this, how they turn out in life. And I think here Solomon says, if the child is learning and applying what you're teaching them, then that instruction must be saturated in the very words of God. That's what you're to teach them. He says in verse 17, he says, bow down, hear, apply unto my knowledge. Verse 20, have I not written you excellent things in counsels and knowledge? The implication in this proverb is that Solomon is teaching God's wisdom. If you go back to chapter 1, what is the beginning of the fear of the Lord? Where does it come from? And what does it produce in people? You don't get wisdom without this fear. And my friends, the wisdom is the very thing that Solomon is trying to convey to his son. You must learn wisdom. And the section of Proverbs here in chapter 22, verse 17, going all the way through chapter 24 and verse 22, this is a section of Proverbs known as the 30 sayings of Solomon, where the parent reveals what he knows to the child. Look at the word knowledge there in verse 17 and verse 20. The parent's information is what the child is to learn, and that is what the child is to set in motion in his life. You need to hear what I'm saying. It needs to be etched onto your heart, and you need to set it in motion in your life. These are the excellent things that Solomon is saying. By the way, that word excellent is really a remarkable Hebrew word. It's kind of unusual. It referred in the ancient world to the general of the highest rank. It actually means the third general or the third commander. And there was a first commander and a second commander, but the third commander was the highest commander. And he says, okay, the excellent things, these are the highest things. If you take the words of God, men and women, and you take those words and that's what you teach your children, you will be giving them the most excellent of all things. There will be nothing greater than this. And even though you think, as you're teaching them, I'm not getting through, it's not hitting home, they're not listening to me, I promise you, if you're faithful in teaching it, if you're faithful in giving it to them, they will listen, they will hear. Maybe not every time, and maybe not completely as they should. And a lot of that is on them as they get older, but I'm telling you, parents, that's your obligation. To have your teaching saturated by the words of God. And this is what Solomon says are his counsels. So let me just stop for a second and ask you. Okay, I want you to stop for a second and think about this. What are you teaching your children? Are you teaching them human platitudes? Are you teaching them things that are good and helpful? Are you helping in their education, teaching them history and math and science and all those things that you use in life? Are you teaching them those things? You say, well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Well, are you also teaching them the words of God? And how are you teaching that to them? Are you paying lip service to it, or are you setting an example in it? You teaching your children, don't worry, trust the Lord. Do you worry, or do you trust the Lord? You teach your children, give everything you have to God. Follow Him in all things. Always be faithful. Is that what you're doing? Or are you teaching them not to be faithful by your actions and by your behavior? You see, that's important, because if all of this is the instruction that you teach them is the result of what they'll be, if we actually believe that, then we have to ask ourselves, what are we actually teaching them? Because the more inconsistent we are in what we say, the more inconsistent we are in what we do, I'm going to tell you, friend, that's a lesson they'll learn. And you won't know, this is the horrible part, you won't know where you were inconsistent until later in life. You won't be able to stop and say, hey, I realize now I should have been more faithful in some of these areas, until you watch your children not be faithful in those areas. And then you just scratch your head and it's too late. Now, I don't want to depress you by that, but I want to encourage you to say, okay, you need to be looking at your life and saying, what am I teaching my children? In the words I'm using, are they the words of God? And then in my behavior, am I teaching them to follow after God? Can they follow my example? Can they see from me how they should be living? Now, because Christian parents are responsible to instruct their children in wisdom, God presents, or I should say God presents through Solomon, 3 tests by which we can determine if our instruction is working. Okay, so this is actually helpful. Here we go. Here's some practical ideas. And this is point number 2. Spiritual instruction ought to produce 3 specific results. Number 1, children should be increasing in personal wisdom. Look at verse 18. All of what Solomon is saying in verse 17, he's bringing to bear. Bow down your ear, hear my words, and apply your heart to my knowledge, because it is a pleasant thing. If you keep them within you, they will be fitted in your lips. It's a blessing that comes with learning God's wisdom. So he encourages his son, learn my wisdom, and when you do that, you'll keep my information with you. By the way, do you know what we call that? When you learn something and then it's with you all the time after that, what do you call that? That's memorization. I'm trying to teach you something that you need to have. You need to learn. Memorize this. And the reason for this effort is that memorization is that wisdom brings delight. It's a pleasant thing. Do you know when a child grows up in wisdom, as he grows more mature, he begins to realize how great it is that he wasn't still acting in an immature fashion. I don't know if you got to if God lets you see this, where you're in the immature to mature stage, you're right in that nexus of these 2 great periods of your life. But I kind of remember it because I matured later in life. I think all the walkers kind of mature late, so we're all late bloomers. So I think this is something I've pushed onto my wife. She was an early maturing person. I was a late maturing person, and I think maybe my children are following my side of the family here. So she's like pulling her hair out in clumps sometimes, but I just tell her, just be patient. I promise you the Walker family does mature eventually. We do. It just takes some time. It takes some time. It'll happen. I know this. I lived it myself. I know this. But I remember being in that nexus region between immaturity and maturity, and there are some moments where you see yourself saying or being very immature, being very foolish, being very, very, just doing stupid things. And in that moment, you kind of get embarrassed, where you realize that 3 years ago, this wouldn't have bothered me at all. But right now, I'm really embarrassed because of what I just said. Now, as an older adult, I told you I'm turning 50 in 10 days. You should write that down. Anyway, as an older adult, as how else do you get presents unless you tell people? As you say, I don't want anybody to know my birthday. So be it on your own head. But as an older adult, when I say something wrong, I know it immediately. It is a rare situation where I say something and it doesn't hit me immediately. I should not have said that. Now, I might try to cover up by just kind of looking off in the distance or getting a blank face, but I know I blew this conversation. This was wrong. All right? That's what wisdom brings. A child can say dumb things, everybody will laugh, doesn't have any idea. We had a guy in our church in Indianapolis who, when Aaron was just learning to talk, used to like to get Aaron to say one word because it sounded a lot like a swear word, and he would get Aaron to yell it in church. That was awfully nice. I'm just sitting there as, thank you very much. Because Aaron didn't know. He was an infant. He had no idea that he was saying a bad word. And the old man thought it was funny. And I didn't think it was so funny. But as a child, you're not going to know that. As a young adult, you might do things that later in life you'll look back and go, that was bad. I shouldn't have done that. But you get old enough, you realize almost immediately that was a bad move. I shouldn't have said that. I need to apologize right now. And I think here what happens is as you grow in wisdom, it says it's a pleasing thing. It's agreeable to you. I would rather be wise than a fool, wouldn't you? I don't want to be a fop, a fool, something to be mocked because I'm just acting in a very stupid way. And the more you learn about God and apply what you learn about God, the greater your personal delight increases because the more like Him you think and behave. And that's a blessing, he says then. Notice the end of that verse 17. You share it with others. You see, this is what happens. As you grow in wisdom, wise words tend to begin to leak out of your mouth. It may even be by accident. I didn't mean to be wise, but here they are. These are the words of God. Because it becomes a part of how you think. You start thinking God's words. In fact, I like the way this is expressed in another proverb. The same proverb is given in an Egyptian proverb that says something to this effect, that the wisdom is actually nailed to the side of your mouth like a tent peg. And I thought that's a pretty graphic way of looking at it. But the idea is that wisdom is so a part of you that it becomes actually a part of your mouth structure. You have wisdom nailed to the side of your mouth like the peg of a tent. What you learn about God becomes repeatable to others. It's an increase in personal wisdom. Number 2, not only is there an increase in personal wisdom, here's the second test. There's a strengthening trust in the Lord. Do you see that in verse 19? That your trust may be in the Lord. I have made known unto you this day, even to you. Here is also a reason for Solomon's words to his son. He says, this is what I'm telling you, specifically for you now, that the more of God's wisdom you know, the greater your trust in Him becomes. As I start seeing God's wisdom on display in a situation, and again, sometimes it just takes time in your life to see that. But as you see God's wisdom on display, the more you say, that's what I always want. Again, 10 days till I'm 50. When I look back at life, I can see times where I did my wisdom, that at the moment I did it, thoughts, this is so right. How could this be wrong? This is clearly right. And then afterward, picking up the pieces of the mess that I created, I realized my wisdom is never the right way to go. But there are times where I thought can't be the right thing to do, but this is God's wisdom and I believe it and I'm going to trust it. So I'm going to go this way. And then later realize this is exactly right. See, what I'm saying is this, is that the greater of God you know, the more wise you become, and the more wise you become, the more you trust Him. Because His wisdom is so great. Nobody knows about life more than God does. Who in here can say he knows more about life than God? He made you. He understands the thoughts and intents of your heart. He exposes it in His Word. He knows you better than you even can know yourself, because you are still a growing, changing person. You're not even fully aware of what you will become someday, even if you're older than 50 in 10 days. You will be unaware of what you will become. But my friends, God knows. And He is so wise. And if you trust in His wisdom, you will begin to trust more in Him. So that you say, I know this doesn't seem right, but this is what God's Word says. I'm going to follow it. This is what I'm going to do. Why would I ever do anything else? I'm only going to follow His words. That's the right way to handle life. And there's a third idea here. And this is really cool, because not only is there a growing personal wisdom in the life of a child, and then a strengthening trust in the Lord as he's growing in that wisdom, but third, there's a growing confidence in other people that child is growing in wisdom. You see that confidence? People become confident in one's wise choices. Verse 21, that I make known unto you the certainty of the words of truth, that thou mightst answer the words of truth to them that send thee. So, as you are teaching wisdom, and your children are growing in personal wisdom, and their trust in God's wisdom is strengthening, and they're becoming more confident in what God is teaching them, then even as they're speaking words of wisdom to others, do you know what other people are saying? There's a person who's growing in God's wisdom. And it becomes evident to other people that God's wisdom is in them. If you teach your children right now, today, no matter their age, young or young adult, you teach your children the wisdom of God at some point in their life, when that wisdom begins to come out of them, people will recognize that and say, somebody taught this person that. I hope it's the parent. I hope it's the mom and dad. Somebody taught her to react that way to that issue. Somebody taught him how to handle that situation. Once in a while, my children will say things or get into situations that I know these are big times for them. Having to do things like buy a car, and these are adult things, right? In fact, right now my daughter is dead set on buying a car because she wants to get a different job, and so there's a lot of things in flux. And I find myself typing to her through text messages, have you prayed about this? Did you talk to the Lord about this? If you don't have a car right now and you could have had opportunities but it didn't work out, do you know who's really controlling that? If you're praying, it's God. So if God doesn't want you to have a car, what does that mean? It means you probably don't need a car, right? I mean, these are the conversations we're having. I'm having similar conversations with Aaron, and Becky is doing the same thing. We're constantly trying to turn their thoughts back to the Lord. And these are the things we were teaching them when they were young. But, when she was 5 years old, she didn't try to buy a car. It just wasn't on her radar. But these are big issues. And one of the things I was telling her just a couple of nights ago, it may have been last night. I mean, this is pretty fresh in my mind, is saying, do you know this is not the first or the last car you'll ever buy? You're going to go through this process probably many times in your life, and it's not the first big purchase you're going to do or the last big purchase. You're going to go through buying a house and selling a house and all these kinds of things. There are all these huge decisions in life that are in front of you. If you learn to make them the wise way now, how much better are you going to be later on? So trying to reinforce that. The things that we were talking about when she was little, okay, trust mom, trust dad when it comes to crossing the street, look both ways. These kinds of lessons I'm trying just on the tiny 3-year-old level you're trying to reinforce. When she got to junior high, it was a little bit bigger, and then in high school it became a little bit bigger, and now in college it's a lot bigger. And I'm sure later in life it even gets a lot bigger. But it's all still really just the same, isn't it? Okay, here you have the wisdom of God. You need to ingest it. You need to follow it. You need to believe it. And as that happens, here's what happens. When other people begin to see that, they say, oh, here's a wise person. In fact, probably the way this is written is somebody sent a child or sent a young adult to Solomon to learn from him for some time, and then came back and was now repeating the wisdom of Solomon to that person. And Solomon's saying, when that happens, the other people will say, look how wise this person has become. He's been with Solomon. He's been hanging around with the wise man who can teach him wisdom. The learner becomes more aware that he is becoming wise, and the sender of the learner becomes more aware that he is learning to become wise. And you can test. You can test your parenting based on these things. Is your child growing in wisdom? Is he learning to trust God more? And is there a growing confidence in others that young child, or whatever age he is that he is growing in wisdom relative to his age? I used to think that you could have the wisdom of Solomon, in college. That's what foolish people think. You can have the wisdom of Solomon, or you can have the faith of Abraham. It takes time for all this to happen. It takes years. It doesn't happen overnight. The Apostle Paul didn't become the great apostle in just the blink of an eye. He didn't even become the great apostle after his conversion. Didn't happen immediately. There was a process in place. And parents, when you speak true words, when you speak God's words into a confused atmosphere like the mind of your child that's being bombarded with all of these different messages from his culture, that's being bombarded by all of these anti-Christian concepts, if you will take the words of God that brings clarity, that wipes away the fog, then you will find that your child will actually grow in God's wisdom. Let's pray. Father,